This is a full-packed agenda, and it's so great you're all still here. So we are now going to welcome Professor Powell to join us again for a second keynote, this time focused on how to remove the roadblocks and how can we propel whole person health forward for everyone. Professor, it's all yours.
All right, thank you.
And we're looking forward to those answers.
All right. So Linda said how to remove the roadblocks, and the first thing I would say is, Linda, you got to come back up here and help. But so what I want to try to do, and I may not get through it all because rich discussion this morning, rich breakout. Again, I want to acknowledge the C team. I think you've met them all now, and I'm looking around where they are. Anyway, a couple of members over here, and so if you haven't met them, we'll make sure you do before the day's over. So I'm going to talk a little about targeted universalism as a way of operationalizing belonging, but also during the break or during the sessions, there were a lot of good questions that came up, and so I went back and tried to refigure the PowerPoint. It may or may not work, but I want to put in a little bit about the mind science. And let me just ask, how many have studied implicit bias of the mind science? Show of hands. So maybe less than half. Okay. So here's, which square is darker, A or B? Can you see A and B? So A is up at the top, and then B is down in the middle. Can you see? Okay, which square is darker? A. How many think it's A? How many think it's B? How many don't care? Okay, and of course the answer is they're the same shade. So if they're the same shade, why does, for most of you, does A look darker if they're exactly the same shade? Now that you know they're the same shade, when you look at them, do they still look darker? Yes. Okay. Okay, what do you see? What shape do you see here? A triangle. I'm glad nobody said Pac-Man, because I get that sometimes. That didn't work. Anyway, basically there's no triangle there. But again, my slides are not configured right. So categorization, this is one of the things I wanted to just bring back to your attention. The mind categorizes. It's actually hardwired to categorize. We can't make sense of the world without categorizing. It's too much information. The analogy I use is that if you think of a little baby, there's so much information coming in. And if we didn't, it'd be like having 6 hits of acid. Remember the last time you took 6 hits of acid? And you couldn't categorize? So what the mind does, because there's so much information, the mind actually has shortcuts. It actually develops shortcuts to make sense of the world. And those shortcuts are what we call categorization. When we link these categories together, they're called schemas. That's just a long way of saying you cannot go through life without categorizing. Now, even with the categorizing, there's still too much information. So now what the mind does is it takes most of those categorizations, most of the information, and approaches it and addresses it at an unconscious level. Remember I said the unconscious is fast and is big? The conscious is slow and small. Now, when you think something, it's the conscious. So what you're thinking all day long that you have access to, that you're aware of it, is the conscious. So all the other stuff is the unconscious. You know, sometimes you're just going along and you say, just going along, all of a sudden something popped in my head. And it was a poem that it didn't just pop in your head. Your unconscious has been working on it, and it says, all right, send it upstairs. And then it's like, oh, wow, so something just popped in my head. That's the good news. The bad news is that the unconscious learns from habits. How many of you heard of Pavlov's dog? Okay, so then it's not just humans, it's dogs too. You ring a bell, you feed the dog. You ring a bell, you feed the dog. You ring a bell, the dog starts salivating. It's like food time. The bell has nothing to do with food. It's just close in proximity and frequency literally creates what's called a neural network. So in your mind, those things become connected. They're not connected in the sort of physical world. They're connected in the mind. So habits, those habits get built up in the mind. So when we have things happening in close proximity in society, in literature, in movies, they actually become connected. And that's a social phenomenon. What that means is that in our society, we categorize by race in 100 millimeter, 1/1,000th of a second. Now that's fast, I can tell you. It's too fast for the conscious mind to register, which means before the conscious mind comes online, the unconscious mind has actually seen and organized around race. And I'm saying that because a number of you in the break is like, I really don't see race. And I believe you. You're talking to me, you're telling me your conscious mind does not see race. But I'm telling you, your unconscious mind does. And sometimes people have heard me say that and they say, who's this egghead from the universities? He doesn't know me. And you're right, I don't know most of you. And I'm not claiming to know you. What I'm really saying is neither do you. You don't know the unconscious mind. We can actually test this. This is not Freud. We can actually look at and do tests, and there's something called the Harvard Implicit Association Test that actually can test what's going on in the unconscious mind. And what's going on in the conscious mind is a reflection of what's going on in society. So if you were in a society where race really didn't matter, there wouldn't be those habits at the unconscious mind. But in the United States, race matters a lot, and it's showing up all kinds of ways. And even the idea, right, that people will say, I never actually had to think about race because I grew up in an all-white community. Duh, all-white community? It's all white. So it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a racist person. It makes you human. So these biases, and then these things, so not only does the mind see race, there are associations with race. There's associations with gender. There's associations with all kinds of things that socially we decide are important, not individually. Socially, that we decide important. So so then you not only see race or you see gender or you see the ethnicity, but then you actually have connections with it. And again, if you're inclined, take the Harvard Implicit Association Test, and they warn you because a lot of times people are disturbed. It's like, no, I don't see race, but this dumb test that I did. So hopefully this loaded properly. This is the face prime. I want you to watch the slide very carefully, and I want you to tell me what you see. What did you see? Saw a face, okay. And what we can do is turn up the speed or turn down the speed. Did everyone see a face? We'll go back one more time. Okay, so now we'll slow it down and watch it again. What did you see that time? See anything? What did you see? White face and a black face. So here's the kicker. This is actually done by a friend of mine named Jennifer Eberhardt. She teaches at Stanford. She just wrote a book called Bias. Again, we can turn up the speed or turn down the speed. The first flash that you saw, we can turn it up so that consciously you see nothing except a blink. Despite that, when you are primed, this is what's called priming, when you're primed with a face at an unconscious level, and then if the face is white, and then you see an object again that you can't quite make out, you're primed to see a gun if the face is black. Because in our culture, there's an association between blackface and guns. Now, if you're a researcher in guns, you know that per capita, the group that holds the most guns, they have the most guns in America, which group? White men. But the unconscious is not a researcher. What it's doing is taking all the data from television, from movies, from records, and in the movies, black men are very dangerous, super dangerous. And that's what the unconscious is. The unconscious watches Fox News. Not really, but the point is that it's taking data from the outside world and it's making associations like Pavlov's dog. And so even though you can't see the face, once you've been primed with a black face, even if you can't consciously see it, the likelihood you're going to see a gun goes up substantially. Now, the interesting thing is, this is true not just for white people, it's true for black people as well. We're swimming in the same water that you are. Now, it's a little different. I guess I should move back. The difference is this. My father, who's 98 years old, is very, very sweet. And he's a Christian minister. And when I was growing up, I got to see him every day. So even though there's all this data about black men being violent, it's like, what happened to my dad? So I have a counter-stereotype experience on a daily basis. But if you don't have my dad in your life, and you get all this data, you don't have a counter-stereotype example in your life. And so you're just getting it unrelenting from the news. So again, women have negative stereotypes about women, comes from our culture. In this culture, we have negative stereotypes about Muslims. In Turkey, they don't have negative stereotypes about Muslims. They have negative stereotypes about Christians. It's not innate. It's innate to categorize, but the content of the categories, the strength of the categories, is deeply social. So I'm going to show you a test, and then we'll get back to what I was going to talk to you earlier about. But my point is, the reason I'm showing you this is that it's easy to believe, and we want to believe, and it's like, we want to be, most of us don't want to carry racist thoughts or sexist thoughts. So the conscious mind says, just don't think about it. Here's a friend of mine, colleague at Berkeley. He wrote a book, and the book is titled, Don't Think of the Elephant.
This is an awareness test.
Okay, watch this test.
How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, you can go back. All right, so all right, tell the truth. How many of you saw the bear the first time? Okay, not very many. Why not? The bear's right there. Why those of you who didn't see them, why you didn't see the bear? Okay, so here's why you didn't see the bear. You get 40 bits of information to use consciously a second. You actually did see the bear, and we can actually prove that all of you saw the bear at unconscious level. But we exhausted your 40 by telling you to count the team in white. Now your conscious mind has been completely preoccupied. Anything that else happens, you don't see at unconscious level. This is true throughout life. So when you go home, or no, coming here today, what was the color of the car at the second stoplight in front of you? You say, how the hell do I supposed to know? Your unconscious mind saw it, categorized it, and it used it in some way, but your conscious mind doesn't see it because it's like, I'm not wasting my 40 bits of information on the color of a car. So the point is that we are constantly processing information. It's affecting us at an unconscious level, and we could not help but do that and survive as humans. And this is very important in terms of understanding stereotype of any group, not just race, but gender, age, disability. The strength of those stereotypes is actually decided not by you personally, but by the society you live in. So now I'm going to talk to you what I was supposed to talk to you about, which is targeted universalism. So targeted universalism. First of all, let me just say what it is. Where you have universal goals and targeted strategies. That's what targeted universalism is. Universal goals and targeted strategies based on how we're situated within structures and culture. What am I talking about? So oftentimes we think, let's just treat everybody the same. In fact, we strive to sort of treat everybody the same, except it doesn't work because we're not all the same. We're not situated all the same. So before we go any further, I want you to do something. If you're wearing glasses, I want you to take them off. And now I want you to read what's up here on this slide. It's orange. Great, great. All right. Now take your glasses and give them to your neighbor. And the neighbor, put the glasses on and read what's up on the screen. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this pair of glasses right here, and we're going to make a copy and give everybody a pair of glasses. So from now on, when you go to a presentation, I want you to take this new pair of glasses you just got and use it. You say, I'm not doing that. That's crazy, right? Well, that's what treating everybody the same means. We're going to get everybody the same pair of glasses. I said, no, that doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't it make sense? What's wrong with that? The eyes are different. And so because the eyes are different, we need a targeted strategy based on your eyes. That's what targeted universalism is. But instead, oftentimes, we say, I treat everybody the same. I don't notice any different. So the guy struggling trying to get in the building where there's no ramp in a wheelchair is like, I'm not going to help him, because I treat everybody the same. We're not trying to treat everybody the same. So that's equality. And equity says, okay, we're going to get rid of the disparities. And so we take a group that's the favorite group, oftentimes white middle class, and say, look at the disparities in health outcomes between white middle class and blacks or Latinos or Asians or even poor whites, and let's close that disparity. That's a really ideal, laudable goal, but it's incomplete. Because, why? What's wrong with that goal of in health, let's eliminate the disparity between whites and people of color? Why is that not a complete goal? It's a useful goal, but it's radically incomplete. Anyone have any idea why? Well, let me help you out here. What if I say, you probably noticed that I have a slight limp. Anyone notice that? You're not going to admit it now, huh? Notice it now? So here's the goal. We're going to eliminate the disparity between me and everybody else. We're going to make it so that everybody walks like me, right? Are you buying it? Are you willing to do that? Why not? Paul, you can be quiet. But anyway, the point is that the normalized group oftentimes doesn't have what we really want. So yes, Native Americans have 3.5 times the suicide rates as whites, but whites have a suicide rates that's too high. We're not just trying to get, and we actually work with a community in Dayton, Ohio. They worked for 10 years to get rid of the disparity between whites and people of color. We were successful. The disparity went away, not because people of color were doing better, but because whites were doing worse. We said we wanted to get rid of disparity. We solved the problem. So that's equity, the way people think about equity. Equity requires us to actually think about getting rid of the disparity. Targeted universalism says equality is interesting, equity is even more interesting, but actually let's state what the universal goal is. What is the goal that we're trying to get every community to? And it's not get to what white men have or what white women have or what this group have. It's something else. State it. Be clear about it. And in terms of stating that goal, because we don't want a universal goal, a different universal goal for each group, we actually want to collectively come together and co-create and decide on what our collective goal is. And that's the universal. But once we have that universal, we then have to say, wow, you know what? We say we want everybody to look at the slideshow and be able to read it. We put the slideshow up there, but Joe can't read it. Why not? Joe is blind. Oh, wow, what are we supposed to do? So that's what targeted universalism calls our attention to. Let's develop targeted strategies based on how we're situated within structures, culture, and stories. One quick example, then I move on. So I'm the right height, but most people are short. You like that, huh, Paul? So I was at the Ohio State University, and they had a rule there that if you are doing anything on company business, even if you're paying for it out of your own pocket and you needed to rent a car, you need to rent one of those little cars that Paul would drive. You know, a car, not a car that a tall person like me would drive. And they even have a special name for them. They call them Paul subcompact cars. You may have seen them. I said, I'm not driving in a subcompact car. And they say, well, that's the rule. We treat everybody the same. And I said, that's a dumb rule. And they had the dean of all things unimportant come tell me, said, John, you think you're so special. Well, it's true, I am pretty special, but not in this way. So it went all the way to the president of the university, Gordon Gee. And he said, I'm going to give a special dispensation so you can get a big car. But they didn't change the rule. So now when I rode around in my big car, everybody was saying, there goes Professor Powell in his big car. He thinks he's all that. I became the problem. So they were trying to fix me instead of fix the system. So targeted universalism actually calls our attention not just to, it's not that I'm too tall, it's that the car is too short. And so a lot of times when we sort of look at populations that are not doing well, we don't say the system wasn't designed for them. We have a school in Baltimore, we had children in school who were not learning because they couldn't see. But it wasn't the kids that were broken. We created a system that didn't serve them. So targeted universalism asks us to actually focus on the system. So when we focus on false universals, we normalize it against a false group. We say, this is how normal people behave. And if you're not doing this, then there's something essentially wrong with you. When we focus just on targeted groups, not just targeted groups, those groups oftentimes get stigmatized. Let's fix Native Americans, let's fix blacks. And then other groups feel left out. Why don't they care about white people? So targeted universalism is not simply focused on marginalized groups or favorite groups. It says, how do we actually construct a system where every group can get to that universal goal? But we're not going to do it by saying we don't notice your difference. We don't notice you have a limp. We don't notice you're tall. We don't notice you need glasses. We say we are going to notice. And we're going to notice those things that are necessary and how the system has been designed to make sure that you can actually your group can get to that universal goal. So again, we sort of approach a lot of times thinking that we shouldn't notice, that a good person doesn't notice that someone has a disability, that someone is tall, that someone needs glasses, that someone is black, that someone is Native American, that someone is a woman, that someone is, but we do notice. First of all, and that's a problem at two levels, right? It's love because we're not really serving them. But it's also a problem because the unconscious says, you know what, the conscious is kind of stupid. We're going to notice all these things. So the unconscious has noticed it. The conscious is trying not to notice it, and the unconscious is noticing it. We have a term for that in the social science. We call it cognitive depletion, because it actually makes us tired when the unconscious is seeing something and the conscious is not. It creates internal conflict. So you can imagine someone coming home from work after a long day and say, honey, how was your day today? It was exhausting. It was so much trouble not seeing race today. But but you have this fight between the conscious and unconscious. So it's like, it creates an alignment. So you have to articulate what your goal is, and then think about the different groups. You have to disaggregate the groups, looking at them both in terms of who they are, geographically, how they're, and then come up with particular strategies, targeted structures to get to that universal goal. So recognizing that people are situated differently. And we have to notice that structures are biased. Not just people, structures are biased. Trying to get to my PowerPoint got totally messed up. So I just have to describe a couple of things that I was going to show you pictures of. Structures are biased. So, and you know, we want them to be biased, right? So if you live in a house, you want some positive things from that house. You want a bed to sleep in, you want it to be warm, you want it to be comfortable. Those are biased, those are values, right? So the example I have, one of our talked to you about the escalator, but another is, so you can think about structures, they're biased, and they're biased usually in a way that we don't notice because they're normalized against a particular population, right? So it looks like, you know, it's just a table, it's just a chair, it's just a room. And then we notice someone that it doesn't fit, and it's like, oh, okay, it's a short table, it doesn't work. So here's one of my favorite examples. I spend way too much time on planes. And you notice how you go on planes and there are the luggage bins on top of the planes, or you put the luggage there. There's now good research showing that those luggage bins have hidden biases in them. Does anyone know the bias associated with luggage bins on planes? They're what? They're high, okay. Okay, they're high. So why is that a bias? Okay, so if you're short and you have these bins up high, it doesn't work as well. Now, is there any group in our country that's likely to be short or shorter? Short people, but who are these short people? Well, I'll give you a hint. Who's taller, men or women, as a group? Men. Huh. So men are taller as a group. So maybe this is a little biased against women. So as a group, who has more upper body strength, men or women? Men. Okay, now we have a double bias. and this one's somewhat controversial, but I think the research bears it out. As a group, who's more likely to carry more luggage? So here we have it. These short women with less body strength coming on all this luggage. And you know, women have figured out a strategy for it. Do you know what the strategy is? Bring a man. That would be another disability. Now what they do, many women actually check their luggage. They say it's too much trouble, so they just check their luggage. But then I ask half an hour on a trip, and they lose their luggage. The point is that whoever designed that had male sensibilities, and was probably male. Didn't think about women, but that's the problem. Didn't think about women. So when we design systems and don't think about groups, we're thinking about one group, but not another group. And the group we're not thinking about looks like, okay, how do we fix women? They're too short. You know, honey, when you come home tonight, I want you to do 15 chin-ups. We're going to fix that upper body strength. Or we could just say, design a system. And you know, it's interesting. When I've said this to some people, literally some guy says, well, how else would you design it? Right? We're so baked into the way the system is, we can't imagine it being any other way. And I said, get some women engineers, they'll figure it out. So this is the heart of targeted universalism. So if you take that with what we're talking about this morning, in terms of belonging, how do you design systems, structures, culture, to actually get people to a certain goal? Whether it's a health goal, whether it's an education goal, whether it's a wealth goal. And I worked in Portland trying to figure out how to get the housing rate up for different groups. And first groups were fighting. It's like, well, you're focusing too much on blacks and Latinos and not enough on. The thing is that once we actually came up with the universal, every group needed to move, including whites. Portland has one of the lowest home ownership rates in the country, period. So the national average is about 77. For Portland, it's about 65 across the board. But in that 65, when you disaggregate the number, for Native Americans, it's 25. So what you need to get Native Americans up to that 75, if that's the universal, it's not just more money, it's a whole different structure than you would use for whites. Once we actually did that, something happened. The tension between groups largely went away because no group was being left out. And we developed different systems. I'll give you one other example and then I'll stop and see where we are in terms of the program. The other thing that when we focus on disparities, what we do is we set up a scarcity model. That is, we say we have to redistribute what the dominant group has so the less dominant group can get more. And the dominant group oftentimes is not feeling it. They don't feel like they have enough either. And they definitely don't want to feel like they have to give it up to a less dominant group or to a marginal group. And the thing about being a marginal group, it means you probably have less, but it also means you have a story that goes with your marginality, that explains your marginality. So why aren't blacks graduating from school at the same rates whites are? We don't say it's lack of resources. We don't say it's inadequate, untrained teachers. We don't say it's crowded classrooms. We don't say it's the curriculum doesn't reflect them. We say they have a broken family. We have a story. That story oftentimes is way off. I'll give you just one example. Almost everyone's heard, even the President Obama talked about in terms of black men and boys. Black men and boys, if they just stayed with their families, if they just became responsible fathers, black people with problems would go away. It'd be great if black men, boys were more responsible fathers. But as a group, black men and boys are more likely to be involved with their children than any group in the country. But that's not the story. Remember, the unconscious actually is not looking at data, it's listening to stories. So what we do with marginal groups is we give them a story to explain their marginality that lies with them. If you change your behavior everything would be fine. And to give you one last example, I did a project with one of the large foundations on health, and they were looking at obesity. And as those of you know who look at this know that obesity is highest, I should say this, it's highest in the Black community, excluding the Native community, because we didn't have data on the Native community. So I'm not, in this case, I'm not talking about the Native community, but it's higher than Latinos, higher than Asians, higher than whites. And it's growing, and this foundation spent $1 billion trying to deal with obesity. It got the number down a little bit for whites, a little less for Latinos. It didn't move the needle at all for Blacks. So it brought me in. You know, a lot of people think I'm expert on all things Black. They're wrong. I'm expert on everything. Anyway, so I went there and they said, we have this interesting thing. We spent $1 billion and we couldn't, and we did it, it worked relatively well for whites, not as well for Latinos. It didn't work at all for Blacks. And they had a story. And the story was something like this. You know, Black people are contrary. They don't like to exercise, and they eat a lot of bad food. So maybe you could go talk to them, get them to change their diets, get them to exercise more. And I said, well, let's look at the research a little bit more. If you look at the research, this is what you find. In 1980, there was not one state in the United States where 20% of the people were obese. By 2010, there wasn't one state under 20% of obesity. So in that 30-year period, we've gone from no states having more than 20 to every state having more than 20, every state, and virtually every demographic. And they're saying, if we could just get people to exercise, I said, I don't think you can explain that in terms of exercise. There must be something else going on. And two things came out of it. One, I said, let's look at processed food, let's look at sugar, let's look at some other things. And this particular foundation said, you know, we have the food industry on our board, so actually we don't want to look at that. So actually, literally, they sent me away. But the other thing that I found is that what produced obesity was different in different communities. And we wanted one approach, and the approach worked somewhat for whites, didn't work at all for Blacks, and we had no ability to pivot except to say, here's a story about why Black people aren't doing well. Not about we have a structure or system or culture that's normalized against one's population, and we assume that it works, therefore, on every population if that population was to behave itself. So this is what targeting universalism does. It invites a process of looking at what those roadblocks are, and it says, let's affirmatively develop systems to get everybody to the third floor, which might mean an elevator. And then more often than not, don't fix the population. And I'm not saying populations don't need some jiggering, don't need some support, but one of the supports they need is a structure that's designed for them. And a story that they co-create where they're resilient and they're positive. So that's the how-to as we think about health. And again, I know that in the work that some of you are doing, you're already doing some of that, but we're here to name it and help support it. And the last thing, going back to my opening, even if you don't see race or gender, God bless you, your unconscious does, so, and the structures do. So it's not a bad thing to see it, it's not a bad thing to name it, it's not a bad thing. And at least in the short term, those issues are going to be with us, and the disparities is a reflection that we've already seen it. So, Linda, that's how we start to move some of these roadblocks. Thank you.